In the 1229 years of its existence, the Western Roman Empire faced a variety of powerful foes, who often brought Rome to the brink of destruction, such as the mighty king of Epirus, Pyrrhus, the Hunnic leader Attila, or the mighty king of the Senones tribe, Brennus. But one man stands above them all, as truly the most dangerous man to ever oppose Rome. The Romans were used to conflict. War was a major component of their society and culture. And yet, they were not braced for the destruction and hardships this man would impose upon them. The man in question is of course nobody else but the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, whose contempt for Rome had dominated his entire life, even from his earliest childhood days. But first, let us set the scene and explore how the Roman Republic came into conflict with the Carthaginians in the first place. The wars between Carthage and Rome are today split into the three Punic Wars, taking place between 264 and 146 BC. The Roman Republic had spent the better part of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC aggressively expanding its borders, conquering most of the Italian peninsula and subduing local tribes, growing from a modest township to a Mediterranean powerhouse. Carthage, on the other hand, had established itself as a major power from its capital in modern-day Tunisia by conquering large parts of southern Spain, the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica, and most of Sicily. From 480 BC onwards, the Carthaginians had been fighting a series of inconclusive wars against the Greek city-states of Sicily in an attempt to seize the entire island. By the early 3rd century BC, only the Greek city-state of Syracuse existed as an independent entity between Carthage and Rome. While relations between Carthage and Rome were good at this time and had been reinforced by several formal treaties between the two nations, their mutual desire for dominance of the Mediterranean would soon lead to conflict. Following a series of disagreements between the two nations on how to deal with a group of mercenaries that had occupied the Sicilian city of Messina, war broke out in 264 BC. The First Punic War wore on for 23 years and eventually concluded with the Roman seizure of most of the island of Sicily. Thus, Rome had won the first tussle with Carthage. Now Hannibal Barca was 6 years old when the war ended. With Carthage's economy being in a sorry state, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, set out to Spain with his eldest son Hasdrubal, in pursuit of riches to rebuild his home city. Hannibal, who was 9 at the time his father left, begged him to be allowed to come along. Hamilcar agreed to his son's demand under the condition that he swore a blood oath to never be a friend of Rome. The next 17 years of his life, Hannibal spent at his father's and brother's sides, conquering much of the Iberian Peninsula for Carthage. When his father drowned in battle, his brother Hasdrubal made Hannibal an officer aged 19, and when Hasdrubal himself was assassinated, Hannibal became commander of the Carthaginian forces at only 26 years old, having already amassed over a decade of military experience. The Carthaginian soldiers were smitten with Hannibal, and remarked how it was as if Hannibal's father Hamilcar had been given back to them in his youth, as Hannibal had the same fire in his eye, the same bright look. Hannibal spent the next 2 years consolidating Carthaginian control in Spain. Fearing Hannibal's rising influence, the Roman Republic formed an alliance with the Spanish city of Saguntum. Looking for an excuse to begin a war with Rome, Hannibal considered this as a breach of the peace terms of the First Punic War, and sacked the city, sending all its riches back to Carthage. The Roman Senate sent an emissary to the Carthaginian Senate in protest, asking them to choose between war and peace. The Carthaginian Senate responded that Rome should choose, and Rome chose war. Thus, the Second Punic War broke out in 218 BC. The Romans had already been reinforcing their southern border ahead of the conflict, anticipating a future war with Carthage. But they were not prepared for what Hannibal had in mind. Hannibal, rather than sending his army to attack Sicily or the south of the Italian mainland, gathered over 40,000 men and 40 war elephants in Spain, and decided to attack the Romans from the north, crossing the highest peaks of the Alps in one of the most audacious moves in military history. It is said that Hannibal's army even passed within eyeshot of the famous Matterhorn mountain. By the time the crossing was complete, Hannibal had lost a large part of his army, and almost all of his elephants. In response to his movements, Rome sent an army under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept and destroy the army of Hannibal. The two forces engaged near the Trebia River in December of 218 BC, and Hannibal was able to use his superior cavalry and war elephants to destroy the Roman army, killing around 20,000 legionnaires and inflicting a first painful defeat upon Rome. Following this victory, Hannibal remained in his winter quarters in northern Italy for several months, before pushing further into central Italy. In spring of 217 BC, Hannibal had reached the region of Etruria. In order to coax the Romans into attacking him, Hannibal devastated the local countryside, moving the proud Romans to dispatch another army under consul Gaius Flaminius. Hannibal again managed to outmaneuver the Romans, trapping their army in a narrow path by the shores of Lake Trasimene in June of 217 BC, once more utterly defeating his enemy and killing 25,000 Roman men. This defeat made the Romans more cautious and led them to take desperate measures. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus as dictator, handing him absolute power to respond to the threats of Hannibal. Fabius decided to avoid direct engagement with Hannibal over the next months, shadowing his movements and following his path of destruction, in the hope of starving Hannibal and his men out. These tactics were unpopular with the Roman people, however, and Fabius was removed from his post as dictator in 216 BC. In the spring of the same year, Hannibal seized the initiative and conquered the city of Cannae, which was also the location of a major supply depot of the Roman Republic. In response to the loss of such substantial resources, the Romans now decided to send an army so large that it would overwhelm Hannibal by sheer numbers. At Cannae, Hannibal won perhaps his most impressive victory of all, managing to use his cavalry so successfully that he enveloped the larger Roman force, killing up to 80,000 Roman soldiers on the day. Given their third major defeat to Hannibal, the Romans became more cautious once more and decided to return to the Fabian tactics of fighting a war of attrition in hopes of starving Hannibal out. Hannibal himself was reluctant to push further into Italy at this point, and most importantly decided not to mount a direct attack on the city of Rome. This is sometimes referred to as Hannibal's only blunder in the war, and according to legend, when Hannibal's officers learned of his refusal to attack the Eternal City, they remarked how Hannibal knew how to gain a victory, but not how to use it. It is worth noting, however, that the city of Rome was heavily fortified, and would have been nigh impossible to conquer by Hannibal's depleted forces, that lacked war engines and secure supply lines. Following Cannae, Hannibal continued to ravage the Roman countryside for 13 more years, until he was recalled to North Africa by the Carthaginian Senate. While Hannibal had won almost every single one of his engagements with the Romans, the tide of war had shifted against Carthage on all other fronts. As such, Hannibal was recalled by the Senate in 203 BC to face the threat of the Roman general Scipio Africanus, who had landed near Carthage. The two generals came face to face in the decisive Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Unlike previous battles, the Roman cavalry proved to be superior on the day, as they had been reinforced by the horsemen of the Numidian king Massinissa, who had shifted his allegiance from Carthage to the Romans. The Romans triumphed, and Hannibal's aura of invincibility had been removed. Following the defeat of their most accomplished general, Carthage had no choice but to surrender, ending the Second Punic War in 204 BC. Hannibal proved himself to be a competent statesman after the war. His reorganization of the Carthaginian economy, including the elimination of corruption and reclamation of embezzled funds, restored Carthaginian prosperity within less than 10 years. The Romans grew so suspicious of this quick economic recovery of Carthage that they accused Hannibal of collaborating with the enemies of Rome and demanded he be extradited to Rome to face punishment. Instead, Hannibal chose voluntary exile in 195 BC, fleeing first to Tyre, then Antioch, Ephesus, and finally Bithynia, continuing to support the enemies of Rome wherever he went. Bithynia would also be the place of his death, as the Romans eventually managed to surround the castle within the city that he lived in. Rather than being captured, Hannibal decided to take his own life through poison. Supposedly, these were his final words: "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Thus, Hannibal died in 181 BC at the age of 66. Hannibal Barca left behind the legacy of the greatest ever enemy of Rome. The Romans were so impressed with Hannibal that they granted him a rare honor. In order to celebrate their defeat of so powerful an enemy, they built statues of the Carthaginian general all over Rome. The distress Hannibal had caused Rome had been so great that even centuries after his death, Romans would often exclaim, "Hannibal ad portas," Hannibal is at the gates, whenever disaster threatened, to emphasize the severity of an emergency. Hannibal's tactics at the Battle of Cannae are still taught today, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest military commanders to ever exist. Now, as always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment and subscribe to the channel.